I did read the book and I do have an understanding of the arguments, but I got to tell you, man, some of this stuff was a little hard for me to understand. So why don't we just walk through it? That's what I want to do. I've got a bunch of questions and an outline here, and a good place to start as any is just how beginning. First of all, that word I think in your use has a number of meanings here. So let's begin with the beginning. And tell me, why and how did this book come to be? Like, what were you doing? One day you were sitting around and you're like, all right, I'm going to write this book beginning with Heidegger. How did that happen? What was the genesis?
So for about a 10-year period, I was in academia doing my undergraduate, then my master's, then my graduate. So this comes out of my academic context, out of my academic work. But I think it's helpful if I sort of walk you through exactly what the motivation of the problem was here. So there are a few pieces that come together. Let me just build the blocks. One of my first questions as an undergraduate that sort of sunk into my soul and wouldn't let me go was this: what is the relationship between how we think about political life? So we're all roughly aware of what it means to think about political life. You have political parties, countries, nations, constitutions, laws, and all of that. That's pretty much within the purview of your ordinary citizen. But what's the connection between that and metaphysics, ontology, first philosophy, our deepest fundamental ideas about what it is to be a human being? Is the human being created or evolved? Was the universe made or is it eternal? What is the nature of the human soul if there is one? Does it make sense to think about a hierarchy of the soul or not? And how do these things relate to our ordinary notions of politics? So it's not obvious that they do. If you were to ask somebody who has a strong opinion about political parties, or just who reads follows the daily news, and you were to ask them, well, what do you think about the relationship between being and time and how that relates to your political opinions? That would probably be a bridge too far. But what I discovered, especially reading Leo Strauss, he was my main entry point into this kind of thinking, is that in fact you can connect the dots between those two levels and see that somehow our ordinary politics passes through an understanding of ideology, which is somehow more abstract, more theoretical, more philosophical. But the ideology itself is a pale reflection or shadow of a deeper set of fundamental philosophical arguments. And that became my main region of study. Heidegger comes to the table in a couple of ways here. The first one is that every serious 20th century political philosopher recognized Heidegger's eminence as a thinker. Everybody said, this guy is in a league of his own. He's giving us something that's absolutely crucial, something that we haven't had the likes of in hundreds of years. I mean, a philosophy that is this profound. And therefore, they were forced in thinking about politics and philosophy to pass through the question of Heidegger. But they come out the other end of it in very different ways, in very different directions. So I think that most Americans would know Heidegger through the way that he's reflected in deconstructionist French postmodern thinking, all of which is hugely indebted to Heidegger, but definitely drives him in a certain direction that is not the only one that his students went into. So there was a time as a student when I was doing two things at the same time. I was taking a class on leftist thinkers who were heavily influenced by Heidegger, and I was translating Alexander Dugin's first Heidegger book. Okay? And I saw, as I put these two things together, that here you have Heidegger in the center of two hugely important ideological and philosophical alternatives, and yet they're so different at the end of that process. And I wanted to make sense of that. How do they read Heidegger differently? Why do they read him differently? In what way were the French thinkers projecting anti-Nazism or leftism or liberalism onto their reading of Heidegger and then missing some core of his philosophical argumentation? You see, what way was the philosophy being distorted by a pre-existing political prejudice? And how would it be possible sort of to go from the direction of Heidegger down to the ideologies, and at the same time, like I put it in the book, the candle burning at both ends, from the ideologies back up to Heidegger, and sort of triangulate and see when we put these different receptions, these different geopolitical receptions of Heidegger together, including the French one, including Dugin's Russian reception, including Leo Strauss, who is hugely indebted to Heidegger, Richard Rorty, an American social democrat thinker who also expressed his indebtedness to Heidegger. What happens when we see what's the source of the divergence in the interpretation of Heidegger? Is it that he just is an open book and you can take him whichever direction you want? Is it that there was an ideological or political motive? What's going on? So that's the task that I set for myself. And again, there are a lot of different pieces of this puzzle, but one thing that was obvious to me before I started working on Dugin and as I started working on Dugin, as someone who has a reception of Heidegger different from the prevailing one, like the deconstructionist leftist one, was that, look, we obviously have missed something super important. Western intellectualism is missing something potentially all important, potentially of decisive importance, something that Heidegger showed us philosophically, that because of the geopolitical circumstances of the 20th century, threw out the baby with the bathwater. You're rejecting Nazism. The Western world is rejecting right-wing anti-liberalism out of the fear that it leads to genocidal Holocaust mania or something like that. And is it possible that in doing so, they overstepped the bounds of their legitimate reach and accidentally got rid of some priceless philosophical reflections at the same time? Well, how would we know that? Only if we were willing to go sort through the debris in some sense and sort it out. Well, that requires a little bit of patience, a little bit of tolerance. Like I put it when I was trying to make sense of why nobody else was into this quite the way that I was. You have to have a high tolerance for cases of mixed merit, because when you're sorting through the debris, there's going to be some legitimate, I'm not going to swear on the channel, there's going to be some things that you don't necessarily want to poke your nose into, but at the same time, you might have that pearl of great price there. And anybody who loves philosophy, who thinks that philosophy is all important, or who defends freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and therefore the dignity of the human mind, would be disgusted at the thought that there's something priceless that we've left behind that we therefore must recover. So that was sort of like the motivation, the intention, the genesis of the project, and why I wanted to put people from across the political spectrum. Dugin, somehow let's call him roughly to the right. Derrida, let's call him roughly to the left. Rorty, a somewhat leftist social democrat. Strauss, somewhat right-leaning critic of, roughly, right? People across the political spectrum get to Heidegger that way, try to get as much as we can on the table to recover that pearl of great price. So that was the project, and Heidegger's the key. He's the key for all of them because he's the 20th century's most outstanding thinker.
Why do you think no one had taken this task on yet? Why was this a question as of yet unanswered? And maybe for some of the folks who are less familiar with Heidegger, maybe you could put that into context. Like, why was it something that people might have shied away from, or why was this opening still here in the philosophical, sort of lineage?
So the simplest thing to say about Heidegger is that on one hand, he was recognized as the absolutely most outstanding thinker. His 1927 book, Being and Time, some of you may have heard about, or certainly would. You're familiar with second and third level reflections of his ideas because they seep their way into popular intellectual culture and popular culture and things like that. But he had a sort of philosophical revolution. But on May 1st, 1933, he also joined the Nazi Party. He made some speeches about the reform of the universities when he became a rector of Freiburg University. And he never famously apologized or repented over or expressed any contrition about his affiliation with the Nazis, his support, whatever the exact nature of it was. So a lot of times that's the easiest dichotomy right there, right? Great thinker, but he's a Nazi. And if you take him too seriously, you too will become a Nazi. There were people who thought that about Leo Strauss, because Strauss in his early 30s wrote a letter that was published, I think, 2001 or so, where he said to his friend, look, we can't crawl back to the cross of liberalism. Just because Hitler wants to kill the Jews doesn't mean that the principles of the right are not the true principles, imperial, fascistic, and authoritarian. So people dug out that letter and they're like, okay, you have an interest in Strauss, you go to the fascist pile. You have an interest in Heidegger, you go to the Nazi pile, right? And everything gets sorted out in its proper place. On the other hand, if you have an interest in all the other theories that are very popular in academia today, and your listeners know are very popular in academia today, you're fine. If you want to do all of those topics, that's okay. But if you want to study the most serious philosopher in the last numerous hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, well, you can't draw those distinctions. You're just tainted. So one of the reasons I think people didn't raise the question the way that I had in mind. What part of Heidegger do we leave out when we interpret him in terms of the 20th century political history and his affiliation with Nazism? Is because, like I said, it brings them too close to to those uncharted territories. They're going to have the guilt by association of even wanting to look there. And I didn't mind, because you have to do it. If you think that what you're searching for is valuable, then you'll go through hell and high water to get it. And if you don't, if somebody doesn't, then it shows you that what they say is valuable is just they're just empty talk, cheap talk, right? So all of the people around me who claimed that political philosophy is the most important way of life, that the philosophical life is the best way of life, who didn't want to raise this question, or who really drilled down on me when I tried to pursue it this way, they just showed that they don't care about what they say they care about. But again, my personal history is something separate here. The issue itself is what's really important. So Dugin was reading Heidegger in a way that I think was unfamiliar to most people in the English language, in English-speaking scholarship. He had written 4 books about Heidegger. He'd said that Martin Heidegger's philosophy is the deepest foundation of the fourth political theory. He identified a key notion in Heidegger's thought as being of central importance to his own thinking. And his first book on Heidegger, let me try to state this in a way that won't be impenetrable. So let's say there are 2 key aspects to Heidegger's thought. One is that he looks back over the history of philosophy, and he shows that it's been a series of distorted interpretations of some basic fundamental insight or event that happened at the beginning. So at the beginning, the first thinkers, they expose themselves to the sort of breakthrough event of proximity to being itself. They raise the question of the meaning of being, what it means to be, what it is, what being is. Okay, I'm giving you a rough shod overview here. That happens at the beginning of philosophy, and gradually there are a series of distorted interpretations of that basic event. And those distorted interpretations become the handed down and inherited tradition of conceptual thought. So that if anybody tries to understand themselves and their situation in the history of philosophy, they have recourse to this tradition which distorts and blocks access to the underlying initial breakthrough moment. Now, Heidegger said, I will show you the sense in which the whole of the past philosophy as we know it has depended on this tradition of distorted interpretation. That's part A. And part B is through my thinking, I will inaugurate once again another beginning or another inception of philosophy. I will drive us back down to that original wellspring where being itself discloses itself past these distorted interpretations and inaugurate a new future for philosophy, another beginning of philosophy. As a rule, the leftist thinkers, they take the first part of his reasoning, that I'm going to show you how the interpretations of the history of philosophy are distorted, and therefore they can relativize or deconstruct or undo all of the capital letter conceptual reasoning that they think is reactionary. Like if you talk about nature with a capital N, or essence with a capital E, or truth with a capital T, they can tell you all of that is a construct, none of that is real. Okay, you're sort of misled by essentialism. So they go half the way with Heidegger. But when it comes to inaugurating another beginning of philosophy, out of their concern that this is going to mean reactionary Nazism and all of the things that they're trying to get away from, they just leave that off to the side. And Dugin, he didn't have that same problem, for example. And so his first Heidegger book is called Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning. So this idea of another beginning of philosophy is front and center for Dugin in a way that it's not even on the agenda, on the intellectual agenda for so many of the leftist readers of Heidegger. Now, there are other figures who for other reasons didn't go along with Heidegger, and I wanted to try to understand what were their reasons. Are they primarily philosophical? Do they have a refutation of his account of the history of philosophy? Do they offer a sound and viable intellectual alternative? Or are they just concerned, which, by the way, I'm not diminishing the validity of this concern, that his thought leads us politically to immoderation, to a lack of standards of judgment, and potentially leads us somehow morally astray, even though it may be somehow intellectually profound, astute, or right. You know, that's a puzzle. And that's the puzzle I was trying to work through.